Good evening and welcome to the August 15th, 2024 Board of Education meeting for Fairfield City School District. Mrs. Lane, will you call the roll?
Mr. Begley.
Here.
Mrs. Birding Miller.
Present.
Mr. Clark. Mrs. Gundrum. Here. Mr. Napier.
Here. Thank you. Mr. Napier, will you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Presentations and resolutions. Mr. Smith.
Yes, Mr. Begley and members of the board, we do have one presentation this evening, and that is a presentation in regard to the end of ESSER funding and the impact on the school district. So at this time, I will turn it over to Mrs. Aug and Mrs. Lane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Begley, members of the board. Mrs. Lane and I are going to talk tonight about the end of ESSER funding and the impact on the district. So I will start with some history and a high-level overview and then turn it over to Mrs. Lane, who will talk about the spending and the impact on Fairfield City Schools. And I was thinking earlier today, this might be our last ESSER presentation. And so that made me curious. So then I went back and I was like, when did we start to talk about all of this emergency funding? And it was March of 2021 when Mr. Crapo and I presented the state-required learning recovery plan. At that time, we had already received CARES funding, so we had some money in district, and we were in the process of completing the ESSER II application. And then just a few months later, in June of 21, I presented our ARP ESSER or ESSER III plan to the board. And I had just forgotten like how quickly they were trying to get this money out to schools and in our hands to spend. More recently, Mrs. Lane, Mrs. Gilbert, and I gave an update on ESSER spending in May of 22. So tonight, after about 3.5 years, this might be our last official ESSER presentation. So just as a reminder and for new members on the board, the curriculum department manages all federal programs and grants. So since 2020, we've been helping to oversee, organize, and plan for the spending of pandemic emergency relief funds in the district. And this meant working closely with student services, special services, the technology department, and district and building leaders to create a plan where we were spending money in a way that would have the greatest impact on meeting the academic and social emotional needs of our students as we tried to negotiate the pandemic. So there were 3 waves of funding. As I just mentioned, CARES money came first. That was in 2020. Then ESSER II and ARP ESSER came in 2021. And you'll see on the next slide that the American Recovery Plan, or ARP, also provided additional grant monies for specific purposes like supporting students with disabilities and homeless students. Each of the grants came with some nuanced guidelines for spending, but in general, we were told that this money should be spent to prevent, prepare, or respond to coronavirus. ARP ESSER came with the additional requirement of spending 20% of funds to address learning loss. As a district, we easily met that threshold, and we can proudly say that we focused our planning and spending on closing academic gaps and providing other needed supports to students, staff, and families. And Nancy will go into much more detail on that in her slides. And finally, I just want to talk about the end of ARP ESSER, like I mentioned earlier. This is the last one to expire. Districts have until the end of next month to obligate funds. And we are happy to report that we are going to meet all of the original spending deadlines of this grant. And I mention this because there are districts in this state and around the country who are going to have to apply for an extension to spend those funds, and it is not ideal. It comes with additional reporting requirements and a lot of additional work in order to do that. So I'm happy to say, we planned, we budgeted, we implemented, and thanks to the collaboration of all involved, we will meet those spending and reporting deadlines. So now I will turn it over to Mrs. Lane.
Thank you. On the next slide, you're going to see the breakdown of each of the, I'll call them pots of money that we received through the CARES Act or ESSER funding. Again, as Mrs. Ogg mentioned, under that ARP ESSER piece, they included some money for IDEA, early childhood special education, and for homeless funds. So those are a part of that ARP ESSER amounts we received. But overall, we received almost $17.3 million in funds. And as we had mentioned in several of those presentations, the focus of that spending was to help our students recover from the pandemic. I'm not going to read every single item that's listed there, but in general, student and staff technology, we spent about 50% of those funds on student and staff technology. Again, to roll out that one-to-one program, and then also to help with some professional development for our teachers to be able to use those tools. About 30% was spent on salaries and benefits, such as the academic support tutors. And then also we did some purchase services, which included those social workers, and then also some online instructional tools. Again, trying to, buy supplies for homeless families. That was that dedicated homeless funding that we received to help support those families. And then with our early childhood special ed money, we use that for like preschool teachers that are listed there. So on the next slide, you'll see the impact. So what's the impact to the general fund now that that money is going away? Those academic support tutor positions have been eliminated for this school year. We have been able to secure additional funding to help with the social workers to help continue with some of those positions. We've also done a little bit of restructuring with some positions to help offset the cost for those social workers. The credit recovery educational assistant, there was one that was eliminated, but there's another one that will revert back to the general fund for this year. And then also any additional technology purchases that are needed will also be coming back to the general fund. We had two secondary technology integration coaches, 2 positions that were reduced and 2 that were kept. Those 2 that were kept will also come from the general fund. And as you probably have heard over time, our need for preschool teachers has not diminished. So those now are part of our general fund cost. And then Mandy and her department do a great job of using our federal funds to try and offset some of these other categories such as coaching and then summer school, possibly trying to be able to provide that, maybe a pared down version, and then also the torch prep services that are offered to our high school students. So those positions and expenses that are coming back to the general fund, those were included in the May 5-year forecast because we knew that we were keeping those positions. And I think that's all I have to present. We'll be glad to answer any questions.
Yeah, Mrs. Lane, how many academic support tutors did we have? Or Mrs.
Ogg
Ogg?
can answer that.
I have a Post-it note here with that information. So we had initially planned for 26 in our learning recovery plan back in 2021. We did not have a year where we filled every single one of those positions. So for example, in 22-23, we had 25 academic support tutors, and then in 23-24, we had 21. So.
Any other questions?
So as Mrs. Ogg said, just to wrap things up, everything will be probably spent by the end of September. That's our goal. We just have a few items right now that we're working through, waiting on some invoices before we can pay those, and then the reporting starts. So And hopefully that'll be the last of that we'll have to do also.
Mr. Begley, if I could just make a comment, if you go back, can we go back to that list of this focus on the spending of funds? Mrs. Lane talked about the technology piece, and the two things that I'd like to just point out, the academic support tutors and the technology. These funds really changed the face of the district for anyone who visited any of our buildings. Even today, you go into a classroom and you will see kids working on those laptops. And I can tell you that prior to getting these funds, we had no plan in place simply because for financial reasons. So that was a huge impact on the district. And not to get further into the weeds in some of these discussions, as we've had conversations about cost-cutting measures, we have looked at technology, but since we've made that commitment to technology, the district is also saving money and not purchasing textbooks. So a lot of, while that's going back to the general fund, there's also some savings there. The academic support tutors, again, focus on teaching and learning. I know that as I took some of you around to buildings over the years, I would point that out to you. You see that person over there? That's an academic support tutor working in small groups. They were all over the place at every level, making a huge impact for our kids. I've often talked about, we have seen that impact in our results over the last several years. There's no doubt about it. And then the last piece I just would like to touch on, Mrs. Lane used the word restructure. So as we had to pull some of these things back, our building administrators would come to the district leadership team and say, can we restructure, because maybe the social worker is so important, is so critical to our success and what we're doing for kids. Can we make a reduction somewhere else so that we can bring that individual back to work or keep that position? So there has been some of that as well, restructuring. So just a couple, again, not to get into the weeds, and there's obviously a lot behind all of those topics, but I just think those were just a few things I thought I would point out this evening for the board.
Yeah, great, thank you. I wanted to ask, because I thought the same thing, that I've heard over and over that the academic support tutors really made an impact.
That was a very tough loss for our students and staff. Yeah.
Anything else? Thank you for that presentation, very informative.